was 18 years old, I hit the road. I didn't know why, just that I had to go. It was 1997, I was all alone, but I didn't turn back from the great unknown. I had a little cash I'd saved working all summer long, so I bought a tent, some bags, and a bike to carry them on. And that fall, Mom drove out of Boston to a quiet little town. Then she opened up her arms and let me out on my own. The mother I have keeps her eyes on me, a steady hand on my back. She says, no use waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the maker to call it off. The days were rough, climbing hills with much too heavy bags, but by the end of the week I felt light as I ever have. And I made it to Atlanta, the rest picks up from there. It's the in-between stories that brought me right here. The mother I have keeps her eyes on me, a steady hand on my back. She says, no use waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the maker to call it off. You might feel like a fool, but a fool is alright. There's no space like the sky, like silver moonlight. You might feel like a fool, but a fool is alright. There's no space like the road, like red sunlight. The mother I have keeps her eyes on me, a steady hand on my back. She says, no use waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the maker to call it off. When I was 18 years old, I hit the road and she let me go. I knew I'd never come home.
They say that every day is a precious gift, and every breath you take, unwrap and cherish it. But my skin is paper thin, and I'm pinned under a man-made hurricane wind. I'll watch until the rain cleans the stain of another man's sin. Like a statue I will wait till I see the sky again. Then I'll drift back inside my mind. That's where my ship of freedom lies. So take me past the waves, where just living doesn't mean you're brave. Out to the open wide, where the a child at the edge of everything. I would open up my eyes and I would see with clarity. But my mind's collected everything. Every step burned in my memory. So take me past the waves, where just living doesn't mean you're brave. Out to the open wide, where the hopeful moonlit guides isn't yours or mine. So take me from this day. Let the crazy man-made chaos fade out to the open wide, where the hopeful moonlit guides, where the hopeful moonlit guides is for everyone's eyes. It's for everyone's eyes.
Well, you take the simple elements, the salt, the sugar, the coffee, the work, the hope, the promise, and the time. Pull them all together through the secrets and the seasons. You're not sure these will work, but why not try? 'Cause win or lose, still we move through the shadows, and they used to be over centuries and tomorrow. Next you add the layers, brush strokes and mirrors, the Mondays and the mornings and the rust. It's a family of footprints, growing and believing, teaching and believing in the dust. And win or lose, still we move through the shadows, and they used to be over centuries and tomorrow. Like a drought that holds the look of conversation, like a sago lily dancing on the side. Part confession, part fixation, punctuation, dreams of sky. Finally the icing, reinventing and branching, looking up and letting something go. It's the turning and the tossing, the setting and the crossing, recipes and stories for the road. Oh, win or lose, still we move through the shadows, and they used to be over centuries. Hey, win or lose, still we move through the shadows, and they used to be over centuries and tomorrow.
My hair is my movement, my instantaneous groove, and my self-realization, and my mighty creation. It's my sight and my seeing, my walking, strutting, being, is me stepping out magnifique. Short and sassy, shake and go, heat resistant, cornrow, micro kink, canacolon, Brazilian blend, extra long, Swiss lace front, a loose cascade, trendy classic, excuse my shade, Nubian locks and Ghana braid. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. My hair is where I'm going. It's the life when I be lowing. It's the gas as I walk into the room. All the secrets, all the praying, all the unsaid things I'm saying. It's the mighty mic drop that goes boom. Short and sassy, shake and go, heat resistant, cornrow, micro kink, canacolon, Brazilian blend, extra long, Swiss lace front, a loose cascade, trendy classic, excuse my shade, Nubian locks and Ghana braids. Da 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 da, yeah. Da 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 da. Da 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 da, yeah. Da 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 da. My beauty is deep inside, so deep it'll take you on a ride. Who you meet, I cannot say, but I warn you, I can show you who I am today. Who I am today. Short and sassy, shake and go, heat resistant, cornrow, micro kink, canacolon, Brazilian blend, extra long, Swiss lace front, a loose cascade, trendy classic, excuse my shade, Nubian locks and Nubian locks and Nubian locks and Ghana braid.
In the noble tradition of your craft, you pride sliced up the floorboards of my conscience and laid bare the bodies I had laid there side by side, like sin and pride. Somewhere in the gut of my ovaries, this reckless abandon from making shines and squeals like a newborn. Right beside it, the sad and worn body of my little planet. My little planet. The one I'd kept in my pocket like a rock. As if by keeping it I would never lose it. Your poems did comfort me. They showed me camaraderie. Someone keeps doing it and insisting it's worth pursuing it. This squealing, shining, reckless observatory. Someone keeps furthering the story.
Why should the devil get all the good tunes? The booze and the neon and the rhythm and blues, the swaying in the darkness and the lovers like spoons. Why should the devil get all the good tunes? And why should the devil have all the real fun? The fire and the freedom and the coming undone, the Saturday nights and the beating of the drums. Why should the devil have all the real fun? My mama told me that the devil likes to dance, dressed up in the shadows, always looking for his chance. Snake in the garden, wanna change my plans. I think the devil is a music man. Why should the devil get all the good tunes? Says he'd sing 'em on Sunday in those dim lit rooms, rocking out the jukebox, making bad men swoon. Why should the devil get all the good tunes? Why should the devil want to steal my soul? This wretched, all lonesome, and this need to be whole. Just a lost little puppy, always looking for a home. Why should the devil want to steal my soul? My mama told me that the devil likes to dance, dressed up in the shadows, always looking for his chance. Snake in the garden, want to change my plans. I think the devil is a music man. If God's so good, why don't he have soul? Don't he hear the music, wanna lose control? Feel the heavy rhythm, wanna rock and roll. If God's so good, why don't he have soul? Why should the devil get all the good tunes? The songs that make you sweat, the songs that make you move, the songs that make you feel like you got nothing to lose. Why should the devil get all the good tunes? And why should the devil keep me up at night, whisper in my ear, do what I like, sounding so wrong but feeling so right? Why should the devil keep me up at night? My mama told me that the devil likes to dance, dressed up in the shadows, always looking for his chance. Snake in the garden, wanna change my plans. I think the devil is a music man. I think the devil is a music man. Why should the devil get all the good tunes? The booze and the neon and the rhythm and blues, the swaying in the darkness and the lovers like spoons. Why should the devil get all the good tunes?
I'm the need you did not pack. I'm the need you did not pack. I'm the need you did not pack. You're gonna miss me down the track when you hit the trail and you won't look back. I'm the need you did not pack. I'm the path you did not take. I'm the path you did not take. I'm the path you did not take. My boom or bust you did forsake, and you won't know when it's too late. But I'm the path you did not take. High on a mountain, valley below, you put one foot in front of the other, and you go, you just go. I'm the beast you did not meet. I'm the beast you did not meet. I'm the beast you did not meet. Feel my eyes and fear my teeth. Who can say just what I've seen? I'm the beast you did not meet. I'm the dad you never had. I'm the dad you never had. Oh, I'm the dad you never had. Open arms, your biggest fan. I can't say what's good or bad. I'm the dad you never had. High on a mountain, valley below, you put one foot in front of the other, and you go, you just go. High on a mountain, valley below, you put one foot in front of the other, and you go, you just go. Yeah, you go, you just go. Yeah, you go, you just go.
One, two, three, hit it. This is a story about a young woman who lived down south. She looked around her one day and she realized that the people were very unhappy. They didn't have a whole lot of say in their own lives. She figured, I have got to do something about this. So she decided she was going to get into the big game. She was going to win that hand, and then she was going to spread the wealth around so that everybody would have a stake. Her name was Stace A. Well, she went on down to the big game, said, I'm here to play my hand, so deal me in if you'd be so kind. And I know it's strange, but please don't mind my skin. You know it's just what I was born in. Well, she anted up like any man, said, let's do this thing, see if I can get myself that ring. Now, wouldn't that be something? Well, you know, those BK boys ran that crooked game owned by Heavy D. Yeah, the big man said, we can't let this woman win. Let's do everything we can to do her in. Yeah, let's make her a has-been. So let's make sure we use that special deck, so there won't be any need to talk about any ropes and anybody's necks. At least not yet. Well, you know, Stace lost the game that day, but she said, I have got to find a way to beat these fools at their own game. Got no time to wallow in the blame. No, you know, you never get anywhere that way. You know? Well, Well, she traveled the land so far and wide, and by she roused all the people to her side, and that started to turn the tide. Well, you know, the people followed Stace that day, but time and time they were turned away from any chance to play their own hand. She said, you know, I think it's time to take a stand. That's right, against that big man. He said, you know, you're reaching way too high. And she said, in fact, we only ever lose when we don't try. So please, don't signify. Well, you know what he did? That big man, he jumped into the fray and he dealt himself a hand that day. He bet the house that he would win. Said, little girl, I think you're gonna take it on the chin. And I just might have to notify your next of kin. He said, you know, it's always been this way, and I don't think that anyone who looks anything like you is gonna win any hands anywhere around here today. Please, just go away. Go away. I think I want to give the drummer just a little bit right here. Go on, William. Played all day and all through the night, and the big man put up one hell of a fight. But as time wore on, his bluffs wore thin, and as the sun arose, it looked like she might win, and he would be the has-been. You know, she won in spite of his marked deck. Well, you know, he said that she cheated. He called her awful names, and he gave her no respect. And it still hasn't yet. No class. Well, she took her winnings. She walked away, said there's so many more games out there to play. I don't know where I'm headed next, but for all you fools out there still cheating with marked decks, well, you're next.
Linger on the path, holding.
Good evening. I'm not as tall as Steve Inskeep. I'm Rebecca Hoogs, and I have the great pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. Welcome to an evening with Steve Inskeep. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that wherever you are joining us from, we are all on unceded lands of Indigenous people. Here in Seattle, we stand on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot people. We recognize the stewardship of this land where we now live and work and the disruption of their care by colonization. At SAL, we are committed to supporting and building relationships with Native communities through real action, connecting with the Duwamish tribe through Real Rent Duwamish, and learning about and featuring the work of Indigenous writers and thinkers. To learn more about our work in this area and commitment to racial equity, please visit lectures.org/about. If you are joining us in person tonight, welcome. And if you are one of the more than 400 households joining us online tonight, welcome. Thanks to the support of our donors, we are able to continue to offer streaming so that the power of SAL can reach both you in this room and you at home. In fact, over 61% of SAL's income comes from charitable support. And as you know, if you've even glanced at your inbox today, today is Giving Tuesday. If you're inspired by the writers that you see on the stage tonight, I hope you will consider a gift to SAL sometime this month. Thank you. Our huge thanks go to the many sponsors who have made this evening possible. I want to thank our season presenting sponsor, the Seattle Times. I want to thank our literary arts series sponsor, Amazon. Thanks to our novella sponsor, Alpha Graphics. Thank you to our essay sponsor, The Cloud Room. Thank you to our bookseller, Secret Garden Books. And thanks to our media sponsors, KUOW, KNKX, and Cascade PBS. Special thanks for major support of our public programs goes to Amazon, the Amazon Literary Partnership, Arts Fund, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, the Echo Fund, the Edgewater Hotel, the Four Seasons Seattle, the Marguerite Casey Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Nesham Family Foundation, the Thompson Hotel, the Washington State Arts Commission, and the Washington State Department of Commerce. I want to thank our board, our volunteers, and our small but mighty staff of 13 who make all of our programs possible. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us this year. Could we have a round of applause for all of our supporters and for you? The format for this evening will be a talk by Steve Inskeep, followed by a Q&A moderated by Libby Denkman. Libby is the host of KUOW's Sound Side and was previously a producer, reporter, anchor, and host for stations Cairo, KFI, and KPCC in Seattle and Los Angeles. Libby will incorporate as many of your questions into the conversation as possible. You can submit a question for the Q&A or vote your favorite questions to the top by going to slido.com and entering the code SAL Inskeep. You can also use this hashtag if you're posting online about tonight. We always begin our events with a reading by a writer from our Writers in the Schools or Youth Poetry Fellowship programs. This year, we will serve more than 4,000 public school students at 34 public schools and at Seattle Children's Hospital. Tonight's writer is Landon Scott from our Youth Poetry Fellowship program. Please join me in warmly welcoming Landon Scott.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be reading my poem called The American Dream. At 8 years old, I sat in the corner, knees to my face, not making a noise, sent there due to my disorder, when I said I liked a boy. That three-letter phrase set my world ablaze, for this is just the start of a continuing story. Matthew Shepard, a teen, was tied up, beaten, and left to die because being gay made you the bad guy. Harvey Milk, a politician fighting for all, whose assassinator barely saw the inside of a prison hall. Say their names. Cassidy Nathan Vickers, whose killer got away and did the exact same thing the very next day. Charlie Hernandez, who was shouted at and called slurs, stepped on a pair of sunglasses by accident and said sorry. Who knew those would be his very last words? Say their names. So maybe they are too old. You say these people are in the past. Well, let's come to the present, where queer people are still being harassed. In the Colorado bar, where the room was as bright as the sun, not because of lights or a rainbow flag, but because of a rapid-fire AR-15 gun. Derek Rump, Daniel Aston, Kelly Loving, Ashley Poe, Raymond Green Vance. Say their names. Amongst all the change, like how gay people can get married, we have seemed to have forgotten how queer people are still being buried. I want to be able to walk in the street, dress how I want to be, and be who I am. But how can I when people are out to get me, even old Uncle Sam? Thank you.
Thank you, Landon. It is now my great honor to welcome Steve Inskeep to the South stage. Inskeep is the longtime co-host of NPR's Morning Edition and of NPR's Up First. His reporting has taken him across the United States, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, Pakistan, China, and beyond. His search for the deeper history behind the daily news has led him to write 4 books, including his latest, which we'll hear about tonight, Differ We Must: How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. As the Washington Post wrote in their review, quote, "There are more than 15,000 books on Lincoln, and yet this is a welcome addition. In covering the interpersonal conflicts and debates that shaped Lincoln's political career, Inskeep writes with a biographer's distance and restraint," end quote. Inskeep looks at 16 crucible moments, difficult conversations or fiery disagreements where Lincoln's evolving identity in politics was forged. Quote, "While this is strictly a story of the past," Inskeep writes in the introduction, "it offers perspective on our disorderly present." He draws the parallels for us. Quote, "America was a beacon of freedom that was also an empire, a nation of immigrants that was suspicious of immigrants, a country of faith that was all about the money, and a land of quality that made people unequal in the eyes of the law." Journalists and reporters have been under attack since at least 2016, if not before. And at SAL, we believe it's critical for us to support, to learn from, and to listen to writers like Steve Inskeep who can help us make sense of both the present moment and the very present past. So Seattle and beyond, I invite you to warmly welcome to the stage the embodiment of the voice of your morning, Steve Inskeep.
Thank you for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it. It's great to be in Seattle. I was just at a reception, and someone reminded me that I am wearing University of Washington colors tonight. So yes, I definitely planned that, and it's not purely accidental. It is good to be here. I imagine there are a few people here who listen to NPR. Anybody listen to NPR News here? I'm going to be interviewed on stage here by Libby Denkman in a little bit from KUOW, and Libby is out in the audience somewhere. And so that you're comfortable as I talk, every 8 to 10 minutes she's going to break in for the traffic and weather and local news. I want to mention a little bit about myself before I get into the topic. I'm a guy from Indiana, which is where Abraham Lincoln spent most of his youth, in southern Indiana in the early 1800s. I grew up there in Carmel, which is a suburb of Indianapolis. My parents were school teachers, and when I graduated from high school, I wanted to get out and see the world. I was kind of ready for a break from Indiana. I wanted to go as far away from Indiana as I could imagine, and that is when I went to school in the next state over, Kentucky. Which is a joke I like to tell, but also literally true. I had read lots of books about the rest of the world, but couldn't quite see myself getting out into it. And so I went to this university on the edge of the coal mining region of Appalachia, where the sons and daughters and grandsons and grandchildren of coal miners attended school and were very often the first people in their family to go to college. It was not the most distinguished university. Chris Offutt, who was a memoirist, a very good writer, attended there and later went back as a teacher for a year and wrote a memoir about his experience at Morehead State University, in which he described it as a high school with ashtrays. Abraham Lincoln, the person we're going to talk about tonight, had less than a year of formal education. So that is one way that I feel that I relate to the subject of this biography. It is really great to have begun my life struggling to imagine going much farther than Kentucky, and then to get out and to see the world. And to see it in many cases for you, to travel to Afghanistan or to Iran or to Iraq or Syria or Israel, where I was just a few weeks ago, or Seattle, which is an amazing place to see some of the great issues confronting us. I got in last night, and the taxi took me to the Edgewater Hotel, and you go through downtown Seattle, which is this incredible mix of things going on. You've got the port right there, taking in cargo from China, which immediately makes me think about our strained relations with China, our struggle not to have a war with China, but also not to allow China's authoritarian system to take over the world. That is a huge problem. And at the same time, we want to be a trading partner with them, and you can see an illustration of it right there. You can move around downtown Seattle and see the incredible contrast between wealth and poverty. The extraordinary income inequality in this country is on display in this amazing place. This afternoon, I got an opportunity to go over and talk about this book at the campus of Microsoft, which immediately made me think of Satya Nadella, the longtime CEO there, and his recent involvement in this open AI fiasco, which maybe a few of you followed. Sam Altman lost his job, got hired by Microsoft, and then is back on the job, but still doing something or other with Microsoft. And it was just a reminder that this big and famous company, which sometimes is seen as kind of, old school, fuddy-duddy. Gosh, it's like 30 or 40 years old, Microsoft. I mean, for internet firms, that's really old. There are people over 30 who work there. But they are a player, one of the players, in this cutting-edge technology that we have to get our hands around as a society and figure out what we're going to do with it, what we're going to do about it. Sam Altman of OpenAI is said to be one of the optimists who believes that we should really accelerate the use of AI, and it's going to do amazing stuff. In preparation even for going to the Microsoft campus, I was reading a review of a book by Fei-Fei Li, who's one of the great thinkers on AI, who is also very optimistic, and she's talking about how she would like artificial intelligence to enhance human capabilities rather than replace them. So that sounds very optimistic, and then I left the Microsoft campus, and I was downtown. I had some time for lunch, so I stopped at the Bang Bang Cafe, which is a great name. And I'm eating my burrito and reading a news story about how Sports Illustrated was caught publishing AI-generated articles by AI authors, like the AI invented an author with a little biography. There was a guy, I wrote it down here, Drew Ortiz. Loves the outdoors, grew up on a farm, totally made up, enhancing something, but replacing actual journalism with something else. And then I was reading a New York Times article quoting Kevin Roose, who covers tech and has a podcast, who described some people who are working on AI not as normal business people doing a business, but he says a religious movement. People who want to create a new God. That's pretty heavy. That's pretty deep. There are a lot of things happening around here that will profoundly affect the future of the world. And it could be next year that this happens, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now. There is a lot for us to deal with. The way that we have any influence over the course of this country and the course of humanity is through our democratic system, through the republic of which we are citizens. Nearly all of us, perhaps some of us are not citizens here and are citizens of some other place. That is the way that we have influence. And that is often on my mind when I'm getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time to go into work, to get ready to put Morning Edition on the air. I'm thinking about the state of our democracy, the health of our democracy. It is true, as you heard, that this is strictly a story of the past, And yet the parallels strike me again and again and again as I research and write about the 19th century. This is the third book I've been privileged to write about the 19th century. It was a time of disorienting technological change. Railroads, the telegraph, and daily newspapers sped communications, bringing distant people together and forcing them to confront their differences with an intensity they'd never known. Rival camps offered contradictory, overlapping, and incoherent visions of the country. America was a beacon of freedom that was also an empire, a nation of immigrants that was suspicious of immigrants, a country of faith that was all about the money, and a land of equality that made people unequal in the eyes of the law. I felt a few years ago that I might be able to illustrate some of that country through a series of meetings that Abraham Lincoln, a central figure of the 19th century, had with different kinds of people. This was the original idea on my mind. And you are going to see, by the way, throughout this discussion, portraits of some of these characters, such as Owen Lovejoy. We'll just continuously see different images there. And I think that this group of 16 people who met with Lincoln give a sense of America's diversity. It was an incredibly diverse country then, as it is now. And I wanted to illustrate that. It was an era in which white men had virtually all the votes, definitely all the power, and nearly all the attention. But it was a tremendously diverse country. And so my initial thought for this book was, let's see Abraham Lincoln in action, meeting with different kinds of people, different races, different genders, different backgrounds, different classes, different parts of the country. Still a lot of white men in the mix because it is the 19th century, but a lot of different kinds of people. But the more that I thought about it, there was something sharper going on that I needed to explore. I began writing this book in early 2020. Maybe you recall there was some news then. It was the beginning of the pandemic, which was a very divisive and polarizing moment. And then there were the protests of that summer about racial justice. And then there was an election. And then the former president denied his election defeat. Then there was the January 6th attack on the Capitol. All of these things happened while I was researching and writing this story of the president who guided the country through the Civil War. And on January 6th, as some of you must know, one guy, at least, carried a Confederate flag through the United States Capitol, which the actual Confederates never managed to do during 4 years of civil war. And I realized that the story that I needed to tell, that was most relevant now, was not just a story of difference, although that's part of it, different backgrounds, different beliefs, but of disagreement. How do you handle disagreement? How do you work your way through a tremendously divided country so that we can make our system function to address these extraordinarily serious and extraordinarily complicated challenges, opportunities, and problems that I was talking about before that we face? I ended up attempting to tell Abraham Lincoln's life story through 16 meetings of people who differed with him. Different backgrounds, but also different opinions. People who found him wildly wrong about slavery. People who found him way too radical. People who found him not nearly radical enough. People who just profoundly disagreed with him. And I tried, as I did that, to think about the way that this great president dealt with disagreement. He did some things that I think are not common necessarily today, can even be rejected or frowned upon today. The title, Differ We Must, is from a letter that Lincoln wrote his best friend, the best friend of his life, Joshua Speed. Joshua Speed was from a slaveholding family. He grew up on a hemp farm. True story. It's just kind of funny to say it, but it's just something they grew. In Kentucky, which was a slave state, and his father owned more than 50 human beings, which he used to work the farm. And that was the environment in which Joshua grew up. Now, as a young man, he moved across the Ohio River from slave territory into free territory, states where slavery had been abolished, at least notionally, and lived in Springfield, Illinois, which is where he became friends with Lincoln. They roomed together. In fact, for 4 years, they slept in the same bed. That's another story we could tell sometime. Not a lot is known about that, but people tended to do that, actually, in that era. In any case, by the mid-1850s, when slavery had become the overwhelming national issue, Lincoln wrote a letter to Joshua Speed in which he noted that Speed agreed in the abstract that slavery was wrong. But Lincoln went on to say, you are not serious about that belief. You are not politically serious about that belief. You understand that this is wrong, but your political views of what we can practically do about it, against it now, are wrong. He went on to say, however, if for that we must differ, differ we must. And he signed the letter, your friend forever. I think that is different than a lot of people are encouraged to deal with disagreement today. No one was ostracized. No one was isolated. No one was canceled. We are encouraged to think that it is morally wrong to talk with or engage with someone who we believe to be wrong about an important issue or even a not so important issue. Lincoln approached things differently. He kept lines of communication open to everyone. He did not necessarily take politics personally, and he ultimately tried to get use out of people even when they were wrong, and Joshua Speed is an example. A few years after Lincoln wrote that letter, Lincoln was elected President of the United States as an anti-slavery candidate, which had never happened in the history of the United States that an openly anti-slavery candidate won. Southern states began to try to secede from the Union to preserve slavery, even though Lincoln had said, I'm not directly threatening you at the moment. And his friend Joshua Speed was among the prominent citizens of Kentucky who worked to keep that slave state in the Union and maintain a majority of the Union in support of the Republic, in support of the national government, in support of our institutions that have been passed down to us today. Lincoln got some value out of this person who he believed to be very wrong and who we would understand today to be wrong. In this book, we have a series of meetings with people who have different beliefs than Abraham Lincoln, but he continued trying to get value out of them. And I think that's a lesson for today because of the nature of democracy. The reason that it is not necessarily wise and not necessarily valuable to ostracize the person who is wrong is that person in a democracy still has a vote, which means they still have power. And that doesn't mean you cave into them. It doesn't mean that you allow yourself to be converted by them. It doesn't mean that you sign up for anything that is wrong, but you need somehow to deal with that person, learn from that person, figure out how to persuade that person. Maybe out of 10 issues, there's one where you can work together, even if the other 9, they're utterly mistaken. And even if you can't do that, you do have to figure out how to outnumber them. Because if we're going to have a democracy, that is necessary. If the beliefs that we hold to be true are to be enacted into law, we need a majority of people on our side to get us through the next election, and the election after that, and the election after that. What is necessary is coalition building. In a free society, which we still have, just checking to make sure that that's true. I'm just latest updates on OpenAI. Yes, we still have a free society. We're not all going to agree. In fact, we shouldn't. If we all agreed about something, that would be totalitarianism. That would be crazy. We would have to wonder what happened to us. But we can build a majority coalition, and this is another word I want to keep in mind. Lincoln was a coalition builder. He dealt with people who had a range of views about this gigantic social problem that seemed almost impossible to address. Slavery in the 19th century was a huge part of the economy. It was, in a large part of the country, the foundation of society is the way that it was seen. It was a social arrangement as well as an economic arrangement. There were huge economic interests riding on it, and it was protected by the law. It was seen as protected by the Constitution. It was hard to imagine anything to do about it. And Lincoln gradually helped to assemble a coalition to do something about it. Owen Lovejoy, who we saw a little bit earlier, was one of those characters. He was someone who was considered a radical anti-slavery abolitionist, someone who by our lights was obviously right, but who at his time was viewed as something of an extremist. His brother, Elijah Lovejoy, had been an anti-slavery newspaper man in St. Louis, Missouri, and he made some moderate statements about slavery in this slave state, and so a mob came and destroyed his printing press. And so he got the press repaired and made some stronger statements about slavery, so the mob came and destroyed his printing press. And then that happened again. And then he realized maybe St. Louis was not the very best place to be doing this, and so he arranged for the printing press to be put on a boat and shipped up the Mississippi River and over to the other side, to the free state of Illinois, to Alton, Illinois. And the boat arrived in Alton, Illinois, where a mob met the boat at the pier and threw the printing press in the Mississippi River. And so he got another printing press and printed more anti-slavery articles until a mob surrounded his newspaper office, set it on fire, and when he stepped outside, someone shot and killed him. Elijah Lovejoy. His brother, Owen Lovejoy, it is said, knelt at his brother's body and vowed to continue the fight. And for the next 17 years was an anti-slavery preacher based in a church in Princeton, Illinois, and regarded as an anti-slavery extremist who was a participant in the Underground Railroad, hid people escaped from slavery in his house on their way farther north, was even put on trial for this. And his defense was, I do not deny that I sheltered a woman who passed through my house, but can you really prove that she was enslaved? And the court could not and released him. But he was considered an extremist. Lincoln took a different view of things. He was, I don't think the word really is moderate, but he believed in the rule of law. He accepted that extraordinary layers of law protected slavery, protected this institution, and so there was only a limited amount that he could do about it. And yet, he ended up joining in coalition with Owen Lovejoy, this man who was far more radical. Owen Lovejoy was one of the founders of the Republican Party, a new anti-slavery party that rose up in the 1850s. He was one of the founders of the Illinois branch of the Republican Party. He and others invited Lincoln to join the party, and Lincoln effectively ran the other way, didn't want anything to do with it. They seemed too extreme. And yet Lovejoy sensed that there was something about this man that he wanted. And so he and others arranged for Lincoln to be put on the central committee of the party that Lincoln had declined to join. And they ultimately, as I think this book will show, joined together, joined forces, and appeared one after the other giving speeches in the 1856 Republican Convention, which was a key moment in the development of the party in this very important state. Lincoln figured out how to deal with radicals. And it wasn't that hard for him to do that, because although he disagreed about the tactics with someone like Owen Lovejoy, he didn't disagree about the substance. And that's something I want to note about people who are considered political moderates. I suppose there are lots of ways for people to be a moderate, and sometimes when you hear the word, the person sounds like kind of a squish. He sounds unimpressive, sounds flabby and weak. I don't think that's exactly the way to describe the 16th president. He did this thing that is really powerful and can be really powerful for us today. He acknowledged the legal right of slave owners to have what they had at the moment, and yet he always insisted that slavery was wrong. And that insistence is what made slave owners think he was dangerous, and they were right to think that he was dangerous. He was a coalition builder. He also was a coalition builder with people who were extremely conservative, or tried to be in different ways. In building the Republican Party in the 1850s, Lincoln reached out to nativists, people who hated immigrants, who wanted to keep foreigners out of power, out of government, and even make it very hard for them to vote. It was fine if they came to work. I know this is strange to imagine. Can you imagine that? Wanting immigrants to come and work, but not wanting them to vote. Lincoln found this point of view repugnant. He said that if the nativists, the know-nothings as they were then called, ever gained power, he would rather move to a country that made no pretense of loving liberty, such as Russia. Literally said that. But he had a friend named Joseph Gillespie, who he'd known for 20 years at least, and who was a nativist leader, a nativist politician. And Lincoln, in running for the United States Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas, very famous campaign, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the whole deal, he needed every vote he could get, and so he reached out to his friend Joseph Gillespie and said, "Hey, can you get your know-nothings to vote for me?" Because they had votes. Lincoln even appeared on stage with this guy. Now this, I would agree, is a morally perilous thing to do. You don't want to appear to endorse Gillespie's nativism, but it was a risk that Lincoln took. If he did that today, reporters would be asking, "Why did you meet with that man?" And he would not have a very good answer, but he did it in the service of this larger cause. And he had tried to keep his moral compass by not pandering to their nativist beliefs. He did not say, "Build a wall." He did not say, got to kick them out. He did not say, "They're all terrorists." He didn't say whatever they were saying in 1858. He talked with these people he believed to be wrong about the issue on which he thought he could get them to agree, slavery. He did not win that campaign, but he got a lot of votes and helped continuing to build the party that ultimately put him in the White House and changed the country. Having been elected President of the United States, Lincoln worked in coalition with Frederick Douglass, who is probably Lincoln's only competition for the greatest American of the century. Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, who's a brilliant guy and a friend of mine, is convinced they're the two greatest Americans, period. And Douglass considered Lincoln to be wildly wrong. Douglass, in the early years of the Civil War, immediately understood, in fact, the early days of the Civil War, immediately understood how to win the war. Southern states had gone to war for the preservation of slavery. And let me just state briefly that you may get into a conversation sometime where someone says the Civil War wasn't really about slavery and the South did not really fight about slavery, it was about state rights. You can reply to them, politely I hope, that in fact the South did start the war and started the war for the preservation of slavery, and the reason we know that is because they said so. You can applaud that, that's totally fine. Alexander H. Stephens gave what's called the cornerstone speech, in which he said that whole idea that all men are created equal was an error. And it was time to found a new society on better principles, that slavery was good and eternal and the way that things should be. And he was the vice president of the Confederate States, and you could find other statements. In any case, Lincoln stood by until the South fired the first shot, then called for volunteers to build an army, and began to fight the Civil War, but did not immediately act against slavery. He even stopped some of his military commanders who issued local emancipation proclamations. He stopped them from doing that. He had them rescind the orders, and Frederick Douglass found this crazy. He wrote, "War for the preservation of slavery must be met with war for the destruction of slavery." And this was entirely aside from Douglass's larger goal, and his moral goal was very practical because the South depended on enslaved labor. So if you could free those people, you would destroy the power of the South. Lincoln was reluctant to do that for a year and a half because he was coalition building. He was trying to keep a majority of the Union in the Union, and he even wanted those people he disagreed with about slavery, who supported slavery, even who were slave owners, but they were willing to be loyal to the country. And so Lincoln moved extraordinarily carefully, and in Douglass's mind, extraordinarily slowly, and Douglass said so publicly in his newspaper, which he used to comment on events. He used words like pusillanimous. Am I pronouncing that correctly? He referred to Lincoln, the President of the United States, as a representative of Negro hatred. That's Douglass's phrase, using the language of the time. He said this in public. He said it again and again. And yet at the same time, Douglass, like Abraham Lincoln, was a pragmatist, which is just a fancy word that means practical. And he was broadly supporting Lincoln's Republican Party, even though he considered it not nearly radical enough, because he believed that they could strike a blow against slavery. When Lincoln finally got around to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, late 1862 was the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863 was to be the day it took effect. It was in many ways a limited document, which we can and do criticize today. It did not free every enslaved person. It declared freedom for the slaves of people then in rebellion, meaning that Lincoln freed the people that he had no power to free at that moment. But Frederick Douglass understood what was going on, that the Union armies were going to advance and they were going to free people. And not only that, the collapse of slavery in the rebel areas was going to lead to the collapse of slavery in every other part of the country where it was practiced. It was a death blow to slavery, and he said publicly that January 1st, 1863 was going to be the greatest day in history, a day for celebration and song. Douglass was very practical and very far-seeing. Lincoln, his administration, got double advantage, as Lincoln said, out of freeing black men particularly because they would take away a Southern laborer, that's one, and they would add that black men very often to the Union Army. They would enlist them as soldiers. Thousands of men enlisted to fight for the Union cause, to fight for the country, to fight for the Constitution, despite enormous political opposition in the North, where there was tremendous racism. Even though people were loyal to the country, they dreaded freedom for black men and wondered what that would cause. Lincoln supported that. Frederick Douglass became a recruiter for the Union Army, promising black men that they would receive equal pay, equal treatment, that they would receive benefits and promotions. And then he became enraged and tried to resign and protest because he realized that Abraham Lincoln had made a liar out of him. Black soldiers were not receiving equal pay, were not receiving promotions, were not receiving equal benefits, and arguably were even in more danger on the battlefield because it was feared that Confederate troops, if they captured black men, would just execute them as slaves rather than keep them as prisoners of war. And so Douglass's superior, as a recruiter, his boss, didn't want to lose this very famous Army recruiter and so he said, go to Washington, go to the president and complain. And there are several amazing things about this meeting, the first one being that it happened at all. Frederick Douglass describes going to the White House. The office in that time was on the second floor of the White House in a room that's now called the Lincoln Bedroom. More recently famous for scandals and scams and so forth, but in any case, at that time it was his office, and there was an ante-room outside which was filled with people waiting to see the president. And the people waiting even went down the stairs. And Douglass observed that these were all white men, and he was the only black man coming to try to see the president. And he was a man who had publicly excoriated the president of the United States. He sent in his card, and within 2 minutes, someone said, come right in. He jumped the line in front of everybody else who'd been waiting. Lincoln met with him, in spite of what Douglass had said, in spite of the fact that Lincoln had read some of the criticism, and in fact, they went on to discuss this, and Lincoln said, you've called me vacillating and slow, among other things. I will admit, in some cases, that I have been slow. And he explained the political reasons for that there was tremendous prejudice in the country, that he'd had trouble getting black men into the Army at all, that there had been an effort to put black men in different uniforms so they wouldn't seem in even that slight way to be equal to white men. And so he was doing what he could, understanding that he needed to do more. And Douglass considered that argument reasonable, because Douglass was a practical man. Lincoln went on to say, you also called me vacillating, and I don't agree with that. Once I've staked a position, I do not retreat. I don't think it can be shown that I ever have done so. And Douglass took that as the most important statement, that Lincoln would not retreat on slavery, having issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, of course, Lincoln did not. Continued to move down that path to the last day of his life. Douglass resumed recruiting, resumed supporting the war. I find in examples like that, examples that I think are valuable for us today. Abraham Lincoln thought in practical terms and also thought about the long term. He ignored a lot of insults. That's another thing that is not at all in style today. One of the chapters, one of the 16 people in this book is General George McClellan, who was a very frustrating general for Lincoln. Lincoln promoted him to the highest command he could possibly give to anybody in the Army, this young and talented general. And McClellan, I think, was a rather insecure guy. And so the more that Lincoln promoted him, the more that McClellan didn't think much of Lincoln, oddly enough. And he ended up writing in a letter to his wife, the president is an idiot. This man who just gave him command of everything. And they began to argue, the president and McClellan, over military strategy, and there finally was an evening that Lincoln went to McClellan's house in Washington, D.C., and waited in the sitting room for a while for McClellan to come home, and finally the general arrived home, walked right past the president without a word, and went up the stairs and went to bed. Think of what a modern leader would have written on Truth Social after an event like that. Think of the controversy. Think of the leaks and the newspaper stories. It would have been great. This is a news story, but maybe not great for the country. And Lincoln ignored this and kept his mind on the long term. It emerged that General George McClellan did not even agree with the president on slavery. In 1862, as Lincoln was on his way to the Emancipation Proclamation, General McClellan handed Lincoln a memo on conduct of the war, and among other things, he said the relations of servitude in the South should not be interfered with. McClellan was loyal to the Union, but had known a lot of elite Southerners and was a kind of an elite guy himself, and was just very sympathetic to their point of view, to their ideas about the world, and he was only notionally opposed to slavery. He thought emancipation should come sometime, but not now. So this is another difference. And yet, Lincoln managed to get some value out of this extraordinarily frustrating man. He was so frustrating that Lincoln's administration finally maneuvered McClellan out of command. He was popular with the troops, so you couldn't really fire him. Instead, they just kind of sent his troops somewhere else until they were all commanded by somebody else, and McClellan was left there all by himself, fuming. And then the replacement general turned out to be really bad and lost a battle catastrophically. There was chaos outside of Washington, D.C., and Lincoln needed somebody who had some organizational skill to get the army back together, and he reappointed or restored George McClellan to command, this guy who considered him an idiot and insulted him and had been wrong about every strategic decision. But Lincoln thought, I need him now. He has a set of skills that I need right now. We must use the tools we have. Rather than sink this guy because of his insults or even his wrong beliefs, Lincoln got some value out of him. McClellan commanded the army for a little while longer and won a big battle, the Battle of Antietam. And that battle, the triumph of that battle, was enough to set the stage for Lincoln a short time later to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which means that Abraham Lincoln got General George McClellan to help him do one of the most important acts in American history, even though McClellan did not agree with it at the time and probably never did. In his memoir, written years after the war, McClellan never mentioned it, this most important thing that he'd ever done. That is political skill. That's thinking about the long term. That's overlooking things that don't seem strategically important. Lincoln thought carefully about the people he was talking to. He empathized with people. That can be different than sympathizing with someone. A military man that I spoke with once said, I try very hard to empathize with a person whom I might fight a war against sometime. That doesn't mean sympathize, doesn't mean believe in their view of the world, but it does mean I need to understand that person because I may need to fight them someday and I need to understand them very well. And it could be that if I empathize well enough, I will not actually have to fight them and we will keep things calm. Lincoln empathized with the other person. He empathized with people he believed to be mistaken. He also empathized with voters. He had a very straightforward idea of human nature. He believed that people acted out of self-interest, which is kind of a dark thought, but it's what he believed, and it makes sense, and it even makes sense that it should be so. We need to look after our interests. If we don't do it, who will? Self-interest could be a very dark thing. Lincoln knew that there were slave owners who even understood that slavery was wrong, but they had inherited these people, and so they just continued with the system because it was in their interest. And they would even say, of course I do this, it's in my interest. So it could be a very dark thing, but Lincoln knew that's how people were, and he tried to harness that self-interest for a higher cause. He did this even when talking with white voters about why they should oppose slavery. He would talk with them about why the slave system was bad for them, why it would be bad as slavery spread into their free states and competed with free labor. He would tell people why this issue was bad for them. He did not even ask them necessarily to sympathize with a black person, but he would say, a black woman has the same right to be paid for her labor as I do, or as you do. And he could talk to the audience that way because he was talking with people who want to be well paid for their labor. He thought really hard about how to use people's self-interest to bring them together for a moral cause, for a higher cause. Ultimately, he did not persuade everyone. Quite a few people in this book do not reach agreement with Abraham Lincoln. Several of them go to war against Abraham Lincoln. One of them is Duff Green, who was a pro-slavery propagandist and also a friend of Abraham Lincoln for 20-some years, who in 1860 met with Lincoln, the president-elect, and tried to talk him out of the Civil War by the simple expedient of enshrining slavery in the United States Constitution forever. Lincoln wouldn't do that. And Duff Green ended up personally seceding from the Union. His state stayed in, but he left and went south. And next saw Lincoln when Union forces captured the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, and Lincoln came along right behind them and met briefly with Duff Green. So there are people that he never agreed with that he ended up going to war with, believing that it was his duty to uphold the Constitution, to uphold the institutions of this republic, that is what he had been elected to do. But it's not necessary to get everyone to agree. In a democracy, it is necessary to get a majority to agree. In the Civil War, there was a kind of election by combat, and Lincoln kept a majority on the Union side. And that majority was able to field a larger army, and that larger army is the fundamental reason that the Union won the war. They simply had more manpower. Lincoln built coalitions that led to his success, and that led to the preservation of the institutions that we inherited today, the institutions through which we can now argue about equality or inequality, and argue about race, and argue about foreign policy, what to do about China, what to do about artificial intelligence, at least until the artificial intelligence out-argues us, however much time we have. It is not necessary for all of us to agree. It is helpful if we can find ways to build majority coalitions, to reach out to that person who disagrees with us about 9 out of 10 things, but maybe there's the one thing we can work on. Maybe there's nothing we can work on, but I can at least listen to you and learn something that will help me figure out how to defeat you. But in any case, to have the conversation, to think about our fellow citizens as potential allies, to get everything we can today for this republic and move through the next election. That is a more modest goal than everyone agreeing and getting along. But it is an achievable goal. It is the basis of democracy. And if we can get a majority that agrees to support and uphold the institutions through which we mediate our differences, we can triumph. And we can pass on those institutions to the next generation, if there is one. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I guess I'm going to get some questions now from Libby Denkman. Do I get to introduce you? No, you can introduce yourself. There we go.
I can introduce myself. Hi, I'm Libby Denkman from KUOW, and I feel like using a microphone next to Steve Inskeep is like hopping in the batting cage with Ichiro. Like, what is going on here? Like, this is fabulous. I mean, obviously, Steve, that was a fabulous lecture and conversation, and now I wonder how you feel as somebody who asks questions every day for a living. You're an amazing journalist.
Wow,
to
thank you.
be on the other side of things during this book tour and
Can we
have
just
to
stop
actually
at
answer.
amazing journalist and just kind of leave it there?
Are you ready for this?
I'm ready for this.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're going to be answering questions from our audience. So if folks want to ask questions, you go to slido.com and use the code SAL Inskeep. But you also got a link in your email, which might be easier. So if folks have that already, we're already getting questions coming in, and I'm excited to put those to Steve. Let's start with one of the sub-themes of your book, which I think has to do with the technology changing during the time that Lincoln is rising in political power. And that's things like the railroad, moving newspapers throughout the country faster, the telegraph is sending information very quickly. How did that shape politics while Lincoln is consolidating power?
I think it was profound, and this is the third book I mentioned that I've written on 19th century, and so I've gotten to trace these changes. It's one way that scholars have thought about this is the country got smaller because distances could be traversed more rapidly. There was a time when it took 6 weeks to get from New York to St. Louis.
By stagecoach.
By stagecoach or and then steamboats came along, and that could be part of the route, and that would speed it up to just maybe 3 weeks or something. Incredible. And of course, it would take months, if not years, to get to the future site of Seattle. I mean, it would just be forever. But things rapidly changed during Lincoln's lifetime. Steamboats, then railroads, and then the telegraph was profound. In my last book, Imperfect Union, in the research for that, I discovered a newspaper article, and it's a description of the first working telegraph line from New York to Baltimore. And people are in Washington getting news of the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore. And the writer says, this is a new species of consciousness. For the first time in human history, you can know with certainty what's happening in a distant city at the same time. And like, wow, like there's the beginning of the world we live in now, where somehow we have information from everywhere and yet we know nothing. And thank you, you can applaud that, it's okay. It's sad but true. And this is one of the ways that the 19th century feels relevant now, because we're going through another one of these periods, and it did absolutely transform politics. One of the episodes in this book is the 1856 Republican Convention in Illinois. They're trying to organize this new anti-slavery party, so it mattered. And they wanted to send a sober, moderate message to appeal to all kinds of voters, including people who were kind of wrong about slavery, but you still wanted the votes. And so they wanted to speak carefully, and it became very hard because all this emotional news was bombarding them. It was 1856. People who've read anything about the Civil War know some of this. There were gunfights in Kansas because there were battles over whether it should be a free state or slave state. Charles Sumner, a United States senator, an anti-slavery senator, gave a speech that a Southern member of Congress considered to be insulting, so he came and beat him with a cane on the floor of the United States Senate. Now, I know there are people here who really like to beat a senator with a cane, but it's a bad idea. Do not do that.
We're not quite there, but people have been elbowing, I hear.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Elbowing their way to power. And in any case, like terrible things were happening, and it was all arriving almost instantly at the site of this convention, which just would not have happened that way 5 or 10 or 20 years before. It never happened. And people had to struggle to keep their cool. In fact, part of the episode, it appears to me, and I'm doing a little bit of reconstruction here, is that Lincoln gave a really fiery, extreme speech. In fact, it was such a fiery speech that the reporters who were supposed to take note of it, it is said, stopped taking notes. Lincoln's friend William Herndon, who normally took notes of his speeches, stopped taking notes. They were just captured by the power of what he said. And everybody ended up talking about this speech that nobody had a copy of. It is known today as Lincoln's lost speech. And there is today in Illinois a plaque marking the site where he gave the speech that's so memorable that nobody remembers it. And part of this story to me also is that Lincoln himself was urged to write down his remarks so they could be published in the newspaper, which often happened with speeches, and he didn't. And I think lost speech is lost because Lincoln thought, I went a little too far.
Yeah, is that he is such a careful person with his words and when he's going to step out an issue? Is it because he thought, actually, it's better if it's lost?
Yeah, I really think so. I think that it was not quite on message, and so he let it go, which is another insight about this guy. He is known as Honest Abe, and he was an honest guy, but he would not say things that would be inconvenient to say. And in fact, he would be so cautious about what he said that some people did walk away feeling he'd been deceptive. That is part of his political style. He would only focus on saying the things that he thought were important to say that could be valuable in an election, and he would try very hard to be silent about everything else.
I want to talk a little bit more about Senator Stephen Douglas and the way that Lincoln used him as a foil. It feels as though before the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Lincoln's not even running for anything, he's like following the guy around and speaking after him, talking on this issue having to do with the Missouri Compromise, and Douglas is trying to replace that with something that would put slavery up for a vote in new states. But Lincoln is sort of using these opportunities to kind of workshop messaging and kind of be the, Douglas will finish speaking and Lincoln will take the floor. Is Lincoln like Michael Jordan, who needs to create an enemy in order to play his best? Like, is that what's happening there?
In a way, yeah. And I should say, Stephen Douglas, we should just note for a moment, different than Frederick Douglass, different person. Just needs to be said, and it's okay if you were out there going, yeah, thank you, I need that. Stephen Douglas would have been the Michael Jordan at that moment. It's he was considered like the rising man, this young senator who was extremely powerful and extremely skilled, a great orator, an asshole, everything. But I'm sorry.
Steve Inskeep said asshole. Oh my gosh. This will be the last speech. Nobody record that.
Can I pause for a total digression, then we'll get back to Stephen Douglas. we do these little 30-second things that are called returns, like tell these like ridiculous little stories on Morning Edition. I hope they're broadcast here. Maybe you cover them up, I don't know. And there was one of these things years ago when I was co-hosting with Renee Montaigne that required me to say the F word.
What?
And so we're recording this, and they're like, no, you can't do that. I said, no, it'll be fine. We'll bleep it. You know, when I don't give a bleep. That's what it'll sound like. It'll be totally fine. And I was told by, because a lot of editorial discussion about this, no, you cannot say the F word even bleeped. Because if you say the F word even bleeped, it would imply to the audience that you were the kind of person who would use that word.
Wow.
Which, in fact, I am. But sometimes there's just too much truth to be told. So we did not do that return. We did some other joke, but then some time passed, and there was another return that would be funny if it had the F word in it. And this time it belonged to Renee Montaigne, my dear co-host for a dozen years. And they let her do it. And so she goes, that's bleeping crazy, or whatever it was. Like she said the word, and then they bleeped it out when it was broadcast. And of course I got mad. This is double standard. It's unfair. I'm like, how
Renee's
come?
reputation was not in doubt. Yours was.
That's exactly this. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. They're like, everyone obviously knows that she would not be the kind of person who would say that word. And therefore, they will know that she would only say it in jest. So she got to say it. But Stephen Douglas.
Yeah, back to Stephen Douglas.
We used some other words that we won't repeat here, but I don't know that particular word. In any case, Stephen Douglas was the Michael Jordan in this kind of situation. And if we were being crude, we would describe Lincoln as almost a troll. Lincoln knew that if he followed this famous and powerful senator around and responded to him, it would elevate Lincoln, possibly. And I think Lincoln, to be more fair about it, also believed that someone needed to make the argument against this great senator, and he was the best person available to do it. And he followed around Illinois. If Douglas gave speech, Lincoln would give speech in the same place the next day or nearby the next day and respond to all his arguments. And finally, Douglas kind of got annoyed by this. And there was a speech in 1854 where Douglas says, I've heard that Lincoln is around and intends to respond to me tomorrow. If that is the case, would he please step forward now before we get started so we can make some arrangement? Because I want to respond to him after he responds to me. And Lincoln does not step forward for whatever reason. And then as people are leaving Douglas's speech after it's over, Lincoln is standing there and he says, I'll be speaking here same time tomorrow. And Douglas showed up for that speech the next day to respond to the response. He engaged with Lincoln, which is one of the handful of things actually you could give Douglas credit for. He was willing to have the argument. He might better have ignored this guy. They end up being great rivals, and of course, a few years later, they did the formal arrangement of the Lincoln-Douglas debates where they did speak on the same stage. And I think this competition all along was very helpful to Lincoln, not only because he elevated himself through this rivalry, but because he knew he had to answer the arguments of a very powerful senator who was very good with words. And there was a moment in which Stephen Douglas was saying that the United States needed to let people move slavery into Western states because it would be good for equality. The great principle of America, equality. A Southern man who owned human property would have an equal right to move there with his property as a guy from a free state who did not own human property. Equality, which is so outrageous. Like, how do you answer that? And Lincoln needed to answer it with equality. He was not a fan, as we mentioned, of radical abolitionists. He thought that they drained support away from the cause with their too extreme rhetoric, and yet in this case he borrowed something from the abolitionists. He borrowed the Declaration of Independence, the line from Thomas Jefferson that all men are created equal. It was in this back and forth with Douglas in 1854, as far as I can tell, that Lincoln first used that phrase that became the great theme of his life, which he continued for the rest of his life, and of course used in the Gettysburg Address. It came from being willing to engage with and respond to the arguments of another person, which, if I may, I'm going on and on. I mean, we're talking about the F word in this answer. We've done everything. But I think this is important. We're trained, this is literally true, we are encouraged, people are trained not to answer the argument of the other person. Do not answer the arguments of the other person. They are arguing in bad faith. They are just BSing. They are just making up things. So ignore whatever they say, just say your soundbite. This is training that people give, and in fact, people will lecture you if you engage with the other person. Sometimes it is actually true, of course, that the other person is arguing in bad faith or raising spurious arguments. But either you answer them or you don't. You don't want to let the other person derail you into being defensive all the time, but there can be value in paying attention to what the other side is saying rather than ignoring it. Oh, thank you.
Because that actually helped Lincoln solidify his messaging and the way he was thinking.
It made him better. I love that that got applause. It's my favorite moment of the night so far. Other than Renee Montagne, the F word. So I think I could go on and on, but yeah, I think that's a powerful, powerful moment.
And so you talk about the way that in that moment with Douglas, Lincoln uses for the first time, the Declaration of Independence to refer to, his being on slavery, all men are created equal. But Lincoln's a very calculated person, as you talk about in the book. I mean, how does he make the choice between morality and pragmatism in these moments? Like when he does step out on these issues, is it always politically considered, or in that moment, is it a moral choice?
I think it is political consideration in pursuit of a moral goal, if I might. Let's talk again about that idea of moderation. How are you a moderate on slavery? I mean, it's really wrong. I mean, either you think that's great, like Alexander A. Stephens, or you understand that is wrong. And there's no like halfway, like maybe we should have people be half enslaved. Like there's no half on that. And there may be issues today where we feel just as strongly, like climate change, just to give an example. I mean, either you're all in or you're all out, and it's hard to see a compromise on that. Racial justice, racial equality, your view of Israel, your view of Palestinians, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of things where people feel that there can be no possible compromise. Lincoln's view was that he was going to get all that he could in this moment, in this election, whatever he could now, without changing his basic beliefs. His basic belief was that line in the Declaration of Independence. He called it my ancient faith. My ancient faith tells me that all men are created equal. He said in one of his debates with Stephen Douglas that this idea obviously had not been perfectly attained by the founders who signed on to it. They had slavery then, just for starters. This ideal was never perfectly attained, he said, but can be constantly approximated in ways that add to the happiness and well-being of all people, of all colors, everywhere. And this, I think, represents Lincoln's political philosophy. Democracy is never over. Democracy is never an end state. Democracy is a never-ending argument. In fact, we tend to have the same arguments over and over again. That can be frustrating, but it also can be okay because it means we don't have a dictatorship yet. And you get everything you can in this election, and then you win or you lose the election, and then you go on and try to get some more. I mean, there's an alternative world in which you lose the election and pretend you won the election and just go on and on. But that doesn't work for democracy. You continue the argument, and that was the way I think that Lincoln squared his ideals with what's possible.
Let's fast forward through Lincoln's election because I want to talk about something really interesting, which is the editorial process. And that is that Lincoln's former political rival, Secretary of State William H. Seward, his future Secretary of State, whom he wanted to become Secretary of State, as Lincoln is working on his first inaugural address, Seward gives these extensive notes on something that is really important, obviously, speech and history. And you kind of detail all the ways that Seward looked at this document and said, here's the changes I would make. And that just seems like a really difficult process for Lincoln in that position. He'd just been elected, and now he's supposed to accept all these edits from somebody who thought Seward thought he should be the Republican nominee. Yeah. What did you learn from Lincoln's, editing process in that speech or others?
First of all, I relate to it. Maybe you do too. I mean, I have editors, you editors, and
everybody needs an editor.
This is commonly said. Everyone needs an editor. That's a joke. It's a joke. It's fine. What I said the first time was totally fine. There was a bad edit. There was an edit just for the sake of editing. But it's true, I relate to the struggle. Someone comes to you and says, I think you've got this wrong, and then you've got to consider what to do about it. And I think that Lincoln could have been offended. Seward had like a long letter full of, he really, this is kind of a joke in the book, but it's also literally true. We've only got 3 problems with this speech, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And he went through with all the different issues. Lincoln took a lot of the edits, understood that Seward had a body of knowledge of Washington that Lincoln, as a guy from Illinois who had not served in federal office for many years, that Lincoln did not have. But then he also made improvements on Seward's improvements. And my favorite example of this is the end. Lincoln is preparing to speak. It's March 1861. A bunch of states that have said, we are leaving the country, goodbye, we are no longer part of the United States. And Lincoln was refusing to accept this, but also didn't want a war if he could avoid it, although he thought it was coming. And the end of his speech says, and I paraphrase here a little bit, but this is pretty close, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, is the choice. Shall it be peace or the sword? And Seward read that and was a little bit horrified. He wanted to have a little calm and cheerful tone in there, and having the sword as your last word is not really the direction you wanted to go. And so he wrote a couple of other alternate endings. And there's one of the endings where he's like writing, he's doing this, it's handwritten, of course, it's 1861, and he writes something about angels, that at some point the angels will save us or something like that. And then he crosses out angels, but then sends the corrections to Lincoln, and there's the crossed out thing about angels on there. And it is Lincoln who then goes through and edits Seward's edit. And he's like, here's, this is, by the way, a thing that I do, editing all the time. Here's a sentence with 15 words. I can do this in 6. Yeah. You know.
Broadcast, that's what you have to do.
We are not enemies, but friends. 6 words. Amazingly memorable. Seward had done that in 15, and I don't remember what they were. But it was Seward's idea. Lincoln edited him, having taken his edit. And then he took this crossed out thing about angels and changed that and made the reference to the better angels of our nature. That is brilliant. That is setting your ego aside and saying, what is it in this person's criticism that is valuable? And then also having the confidence to say, I'm going to take account of your criticism, and then I'm going to express it in my own way. Seward's original reference to angels was something about like Deus ex machina, like God was going to come down and save everything. And if you think about Lincoln's words, he's saying something else that is more in line with Lincoln's view of the world, the better angels of our nature, meaning we are the ones who need to find the way through, because it's a democracy.
It's about agency, individual agency.
Thank you.
See, I knew the editorial process would be fascinating to talk about. Lincoln was somebody with almost no formal education, as Steve was mentioning earlier, but his writing was so clear and concise and direct, and it really jumps off the page to the modern eye, even compared to his contemporaries who were very flowery, took a million words to say something that could have 6, as you mentioned. Was his language celebrated at the time as much as it is today?
There were competing opinions about it. I mean, it's not true that everyone said the Gettysburg Address was a failure. That's kind of a folk tale about the Gettysburg Address, that everybody hated it and thought it was too short. There were people who thought it was a very good speech at the time. He was considered a very good orator in the 1850s. It was seen to be appropriate he would chase around Stephen Douglas, and he was seen as a rival or even an equal of Stephen A. Douglas in debate. And that was something that he would write out and then speak and then maybe go back and write it again for posterity. He also would be criticized for his writing, and perhaps that's the nature of what he did. The essence of his writing was logic. He neglected to do another thing that I think people are encouraged to do, that speechwriters do for politicians, and that's to make things like very emotional and very personal. And I get that. You want to appeal to the gut, you want to appeal to the voter's gut, and so you talk about how I, myself, saved the baby from burning house. Okay, maybe I was 20 miles away at the time, but I was sympathizing with the baby when it was, whatever. But you tell a story, and you try to make it like very visceral and very personal about just one person. And as a storyteller, I understand the instinct. We're in radio, and we'd rather tell a story of a person. It is interesting to me that Lincoln would talk sometimes for hours and not do that. He would reason with people. He would lay out the logic of his argument. He would expose the illogic of pro-slavery arguments. He would give long reasons that people who purported to be against slavery really weren't. And he had confidence that the audience would stay with him. And it was a tribute, I think, to his writing and also to his performance skills that he kept the audience without resorting to a lot of the tricks that we're encouraged to use today. And I think this is important for democracy, too. I don't want to go back to 3-hour speeches, but often the appeal to the emotions, which is frequently all we get in the media, certain television stations, the appeal to the emotions, that's often an appeal to your prejudice rather than to reason. It's an appeal to your fear rather than your confidence. And Lincoln tried to reach people through reason.
I have to just call back to all the folks when Steve earlier was mentioning General McClellan, and there were a few chuckles, knowing chuckles that cropped up in the audience, and I said, those are our real Civil War nerds. I really appreciate them, because I was learning more about the McClellan-Lincoln clash as I was reading your book. And one thing that gave me pause, you talked about the way that Lincoln was able to have so much patience, was able to sort of knock aside some of the drama in order to get what he needed to out of McClellan. But later in the book, you say that potentially his relationship with Mary Todd gave him some experience in how to deal with McClellan. I need you to say more about that, Steve.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I first want to say a word about General McClellan, about the landscape of Washington, D.C. There is a statue of General McClellan on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. Even though he was a very frustrating general, not the most successful general, he was a popular general, he was an important general, and there is a statue of this not too successful general in Washington, D.C. And just across the street and a little bit down is a bar that is named after him, and it is called McClellan's Retreat. I love that. So, yes, Lincoln had a very frustrating marriage. That was not entirely his wife's fault. She gets a lot of the blame. He's also, I think, a difficult person to deal with, and this is the thing that I write about in the book, if I'm not mistaken. He was a politician. Before that, he was a lawyer. He rode circuit. He would go around to different courts. He'd be away from home. Then he was away giving political speeches. He was busy all the time. He was obsessed with politics. He was constantly meeting people and dealing with people. When he wasn't doing those things, he was often reading a book. And when he wasn't reading a book but was at home, he was often depressed. He suffered from depression, or would just be, lost in thought. So he could be a very frustrating person to deal with and a difficult person to deal with. He married Mary Todd, who was herself very interested in politics. Her father in Kentucky had been a very wealthy man, also a slave owner, but was a friend of the great Kentucky politician Henry Clay, Lincoln's idol. So Mary Todd would have met, as a little girl, would have met Henry Clay. She married Lincoln. It is said she married Lincoln because she thought he was going to be president. I don't know that I totally believe that, but I do believe that they both were ambitious and their ambition bonded them, and that she gave him good advice in some cases and was very protective of him. She would see through a lot of people who were out for themselves and not really supporting her husband, and she would hate them for that. And he would be like, well, that's just the way they are. Of course they're out for themselves. It's what people do. But she also could be very difficult. It could be that if she were alive today, that someone would diagnose her as mentally ill or give her some diagnosis. I don't diagnose people who are dead. I don't think that's a good idea. But she had a lot of difficulty. She had a lot of difficulty managing her temper. She had a lot of difficulty controlling her spending. She, as First Lady, spent so much money on redecorating the White House and on clothes and things like that, that she basically had to resort to stealing federal money to take care of things. She was in many ways difficult and embarrassing for the president. She suffered terrible tragedies when their children died, but she could not recover. She could not bring herself back from that. And Lincoln in those moments had to respond with a lot of patience and a lot of forbearance. Forbear is a word that Lincoln used a lot, by the way. And I think that there are some common themes between the way that he would manage his wife and the way that he would manage someone like General McClellan.
The general of the Army of the Potomac.
Yes, yeah. And sometimes Lincoln would actually be the one who would retreat in those cases. I think that Mrs. Lincoln is in many ways a sympathetic character. I mean,
a lot of grief in that house.
Yeah, there's a lot of grief in that house, and I mean, she's just interesting. There's a different way to think about her. I mean, she's considered a very unsympathetic character. One of the biographies in recent times has to basically say in the introduction, this is not a terrible person, this is not a great person actually, but we should pay attention to her. I think she's interesting and sympathetic, first because she is a woman who is politically ambitious and smart, and articulate and everything else, but she cannot pursue a career in politics the way that her husband could because of her gender and for no other reason that I could think of. And that would have to be frustrating, I would think, to be ambitious, to be interested, and you can only operate through this other guy who increasingly is getting more experienced and more confident and maybe needs her advice less and less over time. That's going to be an extraordinarily frustrating situation. And I think that in her later life, after Lincoln's assassination, she a couple of times showed a kind of raw political skill. Yeah. She was broke because she spent too much money and had all these debts, and made a number of disastrous mistakes, but then lobbied Congress for a lifetime pension. And she wasn't subtle about it. She was like writing letters, I'm terrible, I'm miserable, this is horrible. But she got the money. Yeah. Then,
Steve, I know this is crazy to do this with Steve Inskeep, but we have to get to our last question. Okay. We're running out of time. Right. So
I can talk about Mary Lincoln for a while.
We'll call it a post in the biz. I'm trying to hit a post.
Go for it.
But I do want one last question, and in the interest of
No, sorry, go ahead.
In the interest of, this theme of your book, which is Lincoln engaging with people that he didn't agree with, I want to take maybe one of the most, challenging questions that came up from our audience today, and that's from Evan. And Evan's talking more generally about your work and your journalism and your time, of course, at NPR. And it says from Evan, you referenced cancel culture in your speech. And Evan says, you're in one of America's epicenters of cancel culture. This is Seattle, I'm assuming he's speaking about. What would you say to a largely liberal audience to challenge them?
Cancel that guy.
Evan, you're canceled. No. And this is, again, our last question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, to challenge them. I feel that I've expressed, in a way, what I'm going to say, so I don't want to be totally repetitive, but I would suggest that it is possible to engage with someone who has a wrong position, even a morally wrong position, and it does not stain you personally. I would suggest that while we hope that politics serves moral ends, it ultimately is about interests. And that sounds pretty harsh, but it can be good, because you can engage with someone who is morally wrong or who you believe is morally wrong and find out that at least you share an interest. Lincoln is an example of that. He's getting slave owners we believe to be wrong to support the Union because they shared an interest in keeping the country together and got value out of that person. I think Lincoln shows also that it's not always possible. That doesn't mean that you continually turn the other cheek or use your metaphor that you would like, or continually accept something terrible. Some people have asked the question a little bit more sharply. I know I'm about to blow over your post, I'm sorry. And they've been like, why should I, if I'm gay, if I'm black, if I'm part of any number of discriminated groups, why do I have to stand there and take that? Why would you tell me that I'm supposed to do that? And I would not tell anyone to remain in an environment where they are abused and just remain silent for no reason. If someone's being terrible to you at work, you complain, you do what you have to do, you resist. I would not tell anybody to do anything different. But my point is that there may be political occasions where you need to, and it is in your interest to, focus on large goals and engage with people. And occasionally, you may find value, or at least get some use from, someone who is, on other issues, wrong.
Steve Inskeep.
Wow. Thank you. They should stand up.
They like you. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Steve Inskeep is the author of Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. Appreciate everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry to go long on the last one.